Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Test 2 preparation online class for AUE 4861 and 4862. We're just going to wait for the rest of the people to sign in and to join us. So we're just going to give that a few minutes. But in the meantime, please do let me know if you guys can connect properly. There should be a chat section or a comment section where you can actually ask your questions. So please try using that out so that I can actually see that you guys can communicate with me and it is working, so that we can actually make as best use of this session as possible. That is ultimately the goal. You want to be making sure that you don't miss out on anything which would be very important and very crucial to you. So please do make sure that you are able to chat and that you're able to connect, and we will continue from there. All right, so you can just type a message, maybe just type your name or say hi, something like that, just so that I can see that, okay, everyone is available. Okay, so now that we've gotten more of our guests in, I'm going to start. I don't want us to delay this for too long. I'm sure you guys have a lot of studying as well, which you would like to get through. So I like to start off with the motivational quotes, and I think that it's quite appropriate that we do this, especially given the fact that based on yesterday's results for auditing, it seemed that people were quite disappointed with how things went. It is one of those pills which is a bit bitter to swallow. So this is a quote which has been very useful to me, and it says, "Don't wish it were easier, wish that you were better." So this is very profound. It's very relevant to what's going to actually happen throughout this year. If you're a repeat student, then you know this very well. If you're a first-time student, then test one, it gets worse as you go on. It is a lot more difficult as you go through the year. The exam does get harder. So you just need to make sure that you upskill yourself and that you are able to work at a level which will ensure that you pass and that you pass comfortably. So that's what the point of getting additional resources is about. That's what the point of this class is about, because anyone can pick up the tablet and just study. That isn't the problem, but what is more of the issue is actually understanding how to apply what you've learned, how to study it, and to actually bring yourself to that skill level, right? So looking at the agenda, we'll go through a few administrative matters, then we'll touch on internal control, audit evidence, tests of control, substantive procedures, exam techniques, and then any other questions which you guys might have. General and application controls will be covered in the internal controls segment. So those will be touched on as well. If you are doing 4862, then this will be particularly relevant for you, not so much for AUE 4861. Although I would advise that you still gain a decent level of understanding with regards to this. Otherwise, you're just making it a lot more difficult for yourself later on. Okay, so if there are any connection problems or sound problems or any technical difficulties which might occur during this webinar, which may create a recording, and we will send the recording to you guys either later today or tomorrow, so that you guys can actually watch the recording. So if in the event that something does go a bit wrong, don't worry about it. We are going to address it, so you won't be left hanging, so to speak. But if at any problem you guys can't hear what I'm saying, if there is any issues with regards to your connectivity, please just make sure that you type a message in the chat box that is on the screen, and we'll address it as we go on from there. Okay. So now we're looking at internal control, and this is the fundamental concept which is actually underlying what test 2 is going to be about, especially if you're doing 4861. Right. So a few specific outcomes. I'm not going to read each and every single one of them out to you guys, but I will actually forward you guys these slides as well so that you can actually go through this and learn and understand it. But you do need to make sure that your level with regards to internal control is one which allows you to understand all of these points. If there are any one of these points which you don't know, you're not at the level the level of knowledge which you are required to be at, and it's going to manifest itself in some way or the other. Some of this is just direct theory, so it's not even that difficult, but you do need to still know it. And if you don't know it, then it makes it even harder for you to apply whatever you do know to questions, and that's where a lot of people struggle. So you guys do need to make sure that you know there's a lot of universities, they include it in the study guides and they'll say it, but I feel like they don't emphasize enough on this. And I think personally that you guys do need to make sure that you know this well and that you understand it. It's not just a memorization exercise. You do need to understand these aspects of internal control properly. And it's going to help you in practice as well, because how do you go out into practice and you don't know what the components of internal control are? You don't know what the advantages of internal control are. You don't know what the limitations of internal control are. It's nitty-gritty things, but it's things which you do need to know. And it may sound like at CTA level, this is something which is irrelevant. You might not get a direct theory question on it. In fact, you're very unlikely to get a direct theory question on it, but it will always be integrated some way, somehow. In ICC as well, it will come in some way or the other. So make sure that you know these, and they're not difficult. They are actually in your standards. So you don't even need to memorize them. You just need to look at your standards in ISA 315 and ISA 265. You make sure you know those standards. You spend some time going through those standards. You will see that there's enough theory there on internal controls to really help get you through any sort of question which you can get asked. But you do need to know that the theory is there, and you need to know where it is if it's going to be of any use to you, right? So moving on, how is the study approach for this? I think this is more relevant to what you guys want to know, right? You guys will want to know that, you've got this bunch of theory. Now, what do you do with it? So obviously, the first thing is to learn the theory contained in the prescribed textbooks, which is auditing notes, right? So I think auditing notes is quite comprehensive as well. I don't think that you do need to, learn too much more other than what is covered in there. Then you need to know the legislation covered in the ISAs. So like I made mention of ISA 315 and 265, those are your core standards regarding your internal control. So make sure that you actually study these, you highlight the theory there, you know where it is, you know how to refer to it. It's very important, right? So, and it saves you time when you're studying, because you don't want to be memorizing more than you need to be memorizing. So the theory is there. Make sure that you do know and understand it, but obviously having the theory there just helps if you encounter a problem during a question, because exam pressure is a real thing, and you just might wind up having to produce something like the components of internal control, and you might need to critique an internal control system based on that, and you might not remember what all 5 components are. So things like that, then you can actually turn to ISA 315 and it's listed there. So it's just something that will make your life a lot easier. And the last thing is do questions to gain more exposure and practice the application of the relevant principles. So this is particularly the case where you get questions on an internal control system, and they'll ask you for the weaknesses in the system. or they'll ask you to give recommendations, that sort of thing. In AUE 4862, you are virtually, this is like virtually a 0% chance of getting a question like that. So if you are worried about that and you are a 4862 student, don't be, because the odds of getting there are really very slim. To be honest, it would be one of those questions that would come up if the lecturers just wanted to throw you a curveball. I don't foresee them asking that at 4862. At 4861, yes, you might expect that, but not at 4862 level. So don't stress on that, but you still need to know how to answer those questions. And the best way to answer those questions is going to be by practicing as much as you can. And that's what you need to do. Because at the end of the day, every system looks perfect. But then once you actually get into it, that's when you start realizing there were so many weaknesses which you didn't identify. So the only way you're going to get that right is just to do questions and questions and questions and see what triggers a weakness. And then it's going to make sense in that way. There's, practice makes perfect in this regard. There's no theory that you can, specifically just learn. You could memorize the sections in auditing notes which detail what the system should have, but you're just going to make your life a lot more difficult that way, especially since each system is different. So yeah, learn the theory. I'm not saying no, but do questions, because that's how you're going to identify weaknesses. And that's where I think a lot of people struggle. That's where I used to struggle as a student as well. It's those weaknesses which you're just not sure about, right? Okay, so as I said, ISA 265 and ISA 315 are your relevant standards. ISA 610 as well, using the work of internal audits, is another relevant standard, but that's not something which is too critical for internal control. It's pretty much a section within itself. So it does overlap on some points, because obviously internal audit deals with internal control. But for the purposes of test 2, it's not really something which we're going to spend too much of time on. Right. So what is internal control, right? Now, as I've said, it's a term that's often used but not quite understood. So if you look at the definition, it says it's the process designed, implemented, and maintained by those charged with governance, management, and other personnel to provide reasonable assurance about the achievement of an entity's objectives with regards to the reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. Right. So the definition's a mouthful, but what you need to understand from there is what I've actually highlighted here, that the responsibility for internal control lies with those charged with governance and management. It's not the responsibility of the external auditor. So the external auditor is not duty bound to go there and look for specific weaknesses in internal control. If they happen to come across weaknesses, they will obviously not leave that, but it's not their duty. And that's actually something which does get asked in questions a lot. So that is something which you do need to know. So I'll say make a note of this, that it is not the responsibility of the external auditor. Where the responsibilities of the external auditor with regards to internal control will come in will be then in ISA 265. So that's why a question would likely come and give you a scenario whereby there have been, weaknesses identified, or they'll say that some fraud has been perpetrated, something to that effect, and they will ask you what the external auditor's responsibilities are, or they will say that the external auditor has done something, and is this behavior by the external auditor appropriate? Is it in line with the ISAs? Is it what he should have done? So you need to know, and this is something which is very relevant in practice as well. Also important to note is the difference between fraud and internal control. ISA 240 governs the auditor's responsibilities with regards to fraud. So obviously, in that scenario, you need to know that you're not going to consult 265. So you really need to know your standards. You really need to know what is applicable. But everything is in your ISAs. You just really need to know where it is and how to use the handbook. But these standards, what I really like about the internal control ones is that they're very straightforward. So where does it fit into an organization, right? And if you really think about it, there's been a lot more emphasis on internal control happening nowadays, especially given consideration to all the fraud that's happening, the mismanagement, the lack of governance. So it's at a management level, which is one thing that you do need to know. And management set the tone for this. It's not the employees of the firm that set the tone for internal audit. They will pretty much carry it out, but it is ultimately the responsibility of management and those charged with governance, because they set the tone and they are responsible for the control environment. And that's one of the components of internal control. So if you go to an entity, and if any of you are in practice and you go to an entity and that entity, the management just don't care about internal controls. They're not worried about whether payments get approved or not. They're not worried about anything like that. What do you think the employees are going to do? Do you think that the employees are going to worry about any of this? It's very unlikely, because they're going to feel that, look, if management don't care, well, then why should we? And it's going to make it easier for them to do whatever they want to do, because management are not going to follow up. They know they're not going to get caught. It's just a snowball effect. So it happens at a managerial level, and that is the one thing that you need to know. It occurs there, it originates from there, and then it spreads itself across the rest of the organization. Okay. Now, the 5 components of internal control. These are absolutely important to know. You cannot, especially at CTA level, not know this. And to be perfectly honest with you, a lot of CTA students don't know this. And it's not something that I'm saying in an insulting way or in a way to sort of, get down on you. But these sort of factors are where your internal control weaknesses, if any, you are going to identify. They're going to come from one of these 5 components. So if you are in an entity, and whether you're auditing in practice or whether you are merely, if you're just studying it theoretically, you do need to know each and every one of these components and understand how they fit into your business cycles, how they fit into the operations, your computerized systems, every single thing. And you do need to know this off by heart. They are in the ISAs as well, and I've included a reference here, so you can highlight this in your standard if you do forget. But while you'll never get a question which will ask you what are the 5 components of internal control and ask you to list it, unless you're just looking for a way to just fill 2 or 3 extra marks. The truth of the matter is that when you are evaluating, say, the revenue and receipt cycle, you're going to need to know what the control environment is like. And that's where the case study will come in, and it'll give you the system description, right? You need to know the risk assessment procedures, and these are going to be the controls which are in place to address whatever weaknesses there may be. And the information system, this is particularly relevant when it comes to computerized cycles, the control activities, again, tying into whatever controls are being implemented and the monitoring of controls. So, this will come like your supervision, because the cycle can easily say that a purchase order is placed whenever the entity runs short on stock. So it sounds good. Okay, there's a purchase order and it's placed. But then the question is, like, does this purchase order get reviewed? Does anyone maintain any sort of control over how much to order, who to order from, those sort of things? If the purchase order must be signed, so those sort of things need to also be in place. Is anyone signing it? Are they not signing it? And obviously, when you perform your test of controls, it would be to check whether this is signed, but we'll get to that later on. So these are very important. Okay, so each component can be broken down into further detail. Obtaining an understanding of this detail is crucial, right? And the ISOs do this, and they do it quite nicely. So I will recommend that you don't need to memorize it. read through it and put it in your own words, but understand it. You can't memorize every single thing, and you're not expected to memorize every single thing. You'll never get done with your studying, and you don't have the time to do it, right? So you just need to know where the theory is in case you want to make it sound a lot more formal, and it is in your standards, but you still need to have an understanding of what it's saying. So please go through the standards, read through it. It's not going to take you very long. It's not, a massive amount of theory, but it is important, and you do need to know it. And once you understand it, you'll see that everything else just sort of fits in. And these are nitty-gritty things which a lot of students don't do. They overlook it. They feel that it's undergrad knowledge. It's there. It's not going to be tested. Yes, it'll never be tested directly, but CTA is not about testing direct theory. It's about sort of integrating everything, and it's embedded in there somehow. And that's what you actually get wrong. If you get anything wrong in CTA, it's that you're not getting anything else wrong. Because if you really think about it, you're not studying any new standards. You're not studying, auditing standards that were not covered in your undergrad. Everything is the same. It's just the sections which, you might not have known about, which are now suddenly manifesting themselves. And the only way you're going to know about those sections is by actually going through your standards. Yes, you can do questions, but the problem with questions is that if you're going to use that as a means to learn, the thing is that if you go through 10 questions and those 10 questions only cover certain aspects of a standard, whatever those questions don't cover, you're not going to go through those questions in the standard. And then if another exam comes up and it's testing a paragraph which wasn't covered in any of the questions you attempted, you're still going to get that question wrong. So go through the standard as a whole. The questions are not to learn, they're more just to practice and to cement what you know. That's what the purpose of the questions are for. Right. At the bottom here, I've said that we are going to discuss this in more detail. So we do have a series of books coming out on auditing, but that's not going to be now. It's not going to be anytime soon. Actually, it's only going to be around June, July. But what I will do is that once this does get up and running, all of you guys that attended this will get a 50% coupon. I do have your email addresses. So if you guys do want to purchase it, then because it'll definitely be ready before the exam. So then if you guys do want to purchase it, then just as a gift from our side, we'll give you a 50% coupon and you can purchase it. And that will be a very detailed look on internal control. Right? We are going to take it very much in depth. We're going to go a lot more in detail than what your normal prescribed books go. Because we do really feel that internal control is very important. And if you look at the environment that you're operating in now, you look at how the economy is turning, I would say that internal control is a very topical issue. And if you're not spending time on it, you're making a bit of a mistake on that. Okay. So on internal controls, you get two types of internal controls which can be implemented. Right, the first one is preventative controls and detective controls. These are some things which a lot of people also don't know, and I can tell you in practice, it's the same thing. So you guys need to make sure that you understand this well. And so you don't need to specifically take this down. You will get the slides later on during the day, but you need to know the difference between the two. And in a nutshell, it's just that preventative controls are the controls which are in place to prevent fraud and error before they occur, and detective controls are those controls to basically detect fraud and error after they've occurred. So a nice way of remembering it, you can prevent something before it occurs, you can detect something after it occurs. But that's in a nutshell what you just need to know. And you won't get questioned on this specifically, but you do need to know how to be looking at your controls and how to be looking at your cycles as well. Okay. Now, the 6 main internal control procedures which every organization should implement. And this is where your questions actually on internal controls. This is actually a very nice template. I used to like using this as well. It's up to you guys, but you'll get questions which will ask you which controls the audit or the entity should have had in place to ensure the safeguarding of assets, or to ensure that access to their computer system was restricted, or that sort of thing. Your controls basically cover these 6 areas. So You look at your access controls. These can be your normal controls, like having a gate, a turnstile. You need an access card. Even a security guard being there. That sort of things. Those are access controls. In a computerized environment, you'll be looking at passwords, right? That's a very, very good access control there as well. And it's the most common one that you actually do get. So you do need to know that these are controls which will need to be implemented under that category. Then we're looking at authorization and approval. This is where any documents need to be signed, right? So if there's a purchase order, a receipt, an invoice, a delivery note, those sort of things, they need to be signed. So wherever you see a document, basically, if you had to recommend a control, you would need to recommend that, okay, this document gets signed. It's a very quick way of scoring marks, actually, because every document in a business, it needs to be approved. There needs to be some sort of authorization coming from some level. And if there isn't going to be that, then you can imagine what's going to happen. I mean, imagine if there were master file amendment forms that weren't being authorized. People could just change information on employee master files, on debtors master files, to just be chaos. Right, so segregation of duties, that's also something that you need to look at whenever you're evaluating a system. Is there segregation of duties? Because the moment one person is doing execution and approval, it's wrong. You can't approve something you've prepared. You're not supposed to, because where's the independence on that? So those sort of things. If one person is doing multiple tasks, that there is a good indication that it's a weakness. So they'll say the receiving clerk takes the goods from the delivery staff and he moves them into custody and he issues them when anyone requests it, if the stores request it, or the relevant department within this the business requests it. You can't be doing all of that, because that means you can steal it and no one will pick up anything. So look at those sort of things. Right? Those are very, very good indicators that there's a lack of segregation of duties, and that's how you will identify a weakness. Your physical counts, these are easy. These are your typical asset verifications and your inventory counts. So obviously that's just to confirm your existence of it and to tie back to your asset register, your inventory register, and to ensure the completeness of that. So they're the most common ones. Obviously, not really something you'll come across in your cycles where you'll give that as a recommendation, but it's something which you should definitely keep at the back of your mind. Okay, periodic reconciliations. These are your bank recons, your debtors recons, your creditors recons. They don't actually only stick to that. I mean, there can be so many reconciliations done in a business. Those of you who are in practice will know about this. They are literally... there's no limits as to the amount of reconciliations which a business can actually perform. So bear in mind that whenever there is an external party involved, a business would typically do a reconciliation and see that, hey, is what's on my side matching what's on the side of that external party? So it can be ordering, it can be selling goods on consignment, it can be, if you have a reseller, for example. So if you're looking at the revenue and receipt cycle, you can say that, okay, you've sold so much tickets, for example, to a retailer, and they've sold it to someone else, and they come with their sales report and you've got your sales report. You obviously want to match this and say, okay, I've given you so many and they've gotten 80 sold, and you say, no, wait, okay, I've got 80 as well. Okay, so it does match. Those sort of things, those third party, those agency relationships, very, very common as well, where I'd say that you would be looking at reconciliations, because that's how you're going to know. You will find these commonly in business when you are in practice. And then standardized documentation. So it's not really a weakness which you'll typically find. When you go to a business, they'll generally have a specific template for orders, for receiving. You'll see that whenever you are, even at your order form, there are standardized templates for every single thing that you need to do. And that in itself is a control, because what it does is that it ensures that whatever information needs to be captured by the person filling the documentation is captured. So, for example, if a person is requesting stationery, you would need to put your employee number, your department, what you need, the date, the sign, maybe the name of the partner that's responsible for the division you are in, maybe your line manager, those sort of things. Now, having standardized documentation, make sure that those fields are there and that they are available and that you know that you need to fill them in. If they weren't there and you were just told to request stationery, you might not include information such as your employee number, you might exclude the partners, you might not put your business department. And it becomes very difficult because now when they're trying to allocate the cost of this, in stationery which they've allocated, they don't know which cost center to send it to. So that's the purpose of all of these things. That is why standardized documentation, and this is an easy one. I mean, if it's physical, it's just your normal printer. If it's electronic, it'll just be what you are supposed to fill in online. But that's the purpose of your standardized documentation. It's a control that's actually overlooked, but we do it all the time. And it's one thing that you need to make sure that you sort of even give as a recommendation in a question if you ask, because I think it's a very good recommendation to give. Using standardized documentation is a very, very, very strong control. And especially from a completeness point of view of your information and for creating an audit trace, it makes it possible to have whatever relevant information needs to be there. Okay. So before we get to this point, are there any questions which you guys have? If you do, please, you can type in the chat box. It should be on the right hand side of your screen. And if you do have any questions, please just type it and we'll address it. I don't want to move too fast and lose you guys, but if you guys are okay, then I'll continue with the limitations of internal control. Okay. Okay, so there don't seem to be any questions coming through, but if at any point you guys do have some questions, please just type them in the chat box on the right hand side. I do want to try and make this as interactive as possible. Okay, there are limitations of internal control, and this is important to know. It's just I'm not going to actually spend a lot of time on this because I will give you guys the slides on it, right? So I don't want to take up too much time talking about this. It's just gonna waste a lot of time. But what is important to know on this is that it's not that you can take it for granted that the fact that the entity's got a sound system of internal control, you can assume that the control environment will be functioning without any error. It's just not how it works, and it just never does in practice. So I will give you these slides. You can look at them, but they are also contained in your ISAs. So it is important just to go through it from there, right? It's just something to keep at the back of your mind and not to forget about. The advantages of internal control. So internal control obviously must be having a lot of advantages, and these will not be asked to you directly. So it's just, again, it's good to know. It might come maybe as a filler type of question, just for 2 marks or something like that. So it's just good to know a few of these advantages. There are obviously a lot more, and that will be in our publication, but it's just useful theory to know just in case, and it's nice background knowledge to have as well. The same thing with the disadvantages. It's good to know as well. So like I said, once you have these slides, go through them. You don't need to study them in great detail because you aren't going to get asked what the advantages and what the disadvantages are. It's not the type of question you're going to get in CCA, right? So then we said an overview of ISA 265, right? So ISA 265 deals with the responsibility of the auditor to communicate to those charged with governance and management regarding deficiencies in internal control that the auditor has identified during the audits, and that in the auditor's professional judgment are of sufficient importance to merit their respective attentions. So the main thing here is that it talks about significant deficiencies, right? So it's not just a regular deficiency which the auditor feels, well, this control could be better, but it's not a crisis. For example, he sees that payments are approved by one person and he feels that they should actually be approved by two people. It's not a train smash if they're not approved by more than by one, obviously depending on the size of the organization as well. But those sort of things, it's not a travesty. Although to some, it's very subjective. Some people might feel that no, it is a huge issue. So this is an important standard, and you can actually get asked questions on it, and they might flat out ask you in the question. So you won't get a question which will be asking you to identify the strengths and weaknesses if you're on 4862. But what you can get is a question saying that the auditor has identified weakness 1, 2, 3 in the system. Or they'll tell you that this is the system and these are the weaknesses which the auditor has identified. How do you then address these weaknesses? And what would the auditor's responsibility do? What should he, what response should he have? They like using that sort of term. What should the response of the auditor be? So these are covered in ISA 265, and basically it's like I said, it's a very short standard, but it's very, very significant. And in a nutshell, the auditor has to communicate significant weaknesses that he has identified during the audit with management and those charged with governance. So he doesn't have to go out and specifically look for this. So if you are now on an audit, you don't have to go and hunt and find what internal control weaknesses are prevalent at the client. You're not there to do that. But if something comes your way, then the auditor needs to evaluate and say, okay, hang on, this is a weakness I've identified. But is it a significant weakness? Do I really need to bring this to the attention of management or not? And if they don't need to, then obviously they don't need to do anything further than that. This standard wouldn't be applicable. If the weakness is assessed as being material, or it's being assessed as being significant rather, then the auditor does need to bring this to the attention of management using the requirements set out in ISA 265. And to be perfectly honest, in most questions, if they are going to ask you what the auditor should do with regards to the weaknesses, it's going to be that they have to report it. In most cases, it's going to be a significant weakness. So look at the mark allocation. Obviously, if it's something like 2 marks, then they're going to say that, look, you should just evaluate it and follow what ISA 265 says. But if it's something a bit more substantial, maybe like a 5 to 10 mark question, then it's definitely going to be asking you to say that, okay, hang on, he needs to evaluate whether the weakness is significant or not. And if it is significant, then he needs to communicate these with management and those charged with governance. And it's really, it's not difficult. That's actually all that there is to it. How he chooses to do it might be obviously in a normal meeting, or if he wants to prepare a report, he is welcome to do that. Obviously, in auditing, we prefer having everything in a formal context. So in all likelihood, you might want to just prepare it in a document and send it through. But that is what would happen. And that's pretty much it. There's nothing more to it, and then he'll carry on with the audit as normal. So those sort of things are, or maybe we'll even do this at the end of the audit, but that's pretty much all that there is. It's just an aspect. It's not going to be something which the auditor needs to break too much time on. Okay. Now, this is probably the main reason which a lot of you guys are here, and the crux, I guess, of what will be examined. Now, just as a guideline, if you are doing 4861, you are not going to get a very high level of computerization asked. Generally, they sway away from this at 4861 level. So if you're doing CCA level 1, you don't need to stress a heck of a lot on this. But if you are doing 4862, then these become much more relevant to you, and you do need to know this extremely well. And a lot of students do struggle with this, and the reason that they struggle with this is because they're not familiar with internal control and they don't understand what internal control actually is. And that's why I've actually covered that section on internal control as much as I have, because you do need to have a lot of context before you can do this. It's your foundational knowledge. Those components of internal control, all of that tie into this. These just build on that. They're not new concepts. They're concepts that build on existing concepts. So you do need to make sure, and I've highlighted this in the slides as well. So the odds of you getting a purely manual system is virtually zero. Don't expect it. Don't wait for it, because it's never going to happen. Not in practice, not in theory. It's just not going to happen. And I really can't remember ever seeing a question that has been set at any university where it's been a purely manual system. I just really can't. So when you look at those controls in auditing notes, I think there's 5 chapters there giving the system descriptions of revenue. When you're looking at your cycles, they're good to know, but it's not very practical. So don't go on a quest to memorize that, because as I said, the systems change and you are not going to get a purely manual system. It's just not going to happen. You need to know how to have, you're going to have a hybrid of both, right? And as time comes on, it's going to become more and more in favor of being computerized, but that's what's going to happen. Okay, so the first thing is general controls, and these are very easy, right? So policies and procedures which relate to applications and support the effective functioning of application controls. The definition of this is included in your ISS, so you don't need to memorize it. And these are just examples of common internal general controls which will be asked, right? So you've got your program change controls, software acquisition controls, and your access security controls. So with your program change controls, these would basically be where you've got a particular software system and they want to change it now. And that can happen. And maybe you've actually worked in an environment where it has happened, where they've migrated from one accounting system to another accounting system. So obviously there needs to be things in place in order to do this. And the nice thing about general controls is that they very much lists that you can study and you can write them down, because they're generally the same everywhere. Any type of entity that's going to change its software system would need to have certain things. So they would have had to have done a proper due diligence process on the software system they're going to acquire. They have to make sure that they've actually checked that the new software package is going to be better and that it's going to meet the requirements of the users. And that's a control which normally gets tested when it comes to when you're creating a software system. But you need to also do some level of user acceptance when you are going to buy a new software system, because what happens if it's too complex for your staff to use? What happens if it's too advanced for your business? Or what happens if it's not advanced enough? So those sort of things you need to know. Auditing notes does have these in detail, so there's no point in me copying and pasting it here and just reading it out. It's not going to really achieve anything. But they generally are the same. So I would say that in your auditing notes, if you're going to swat anything off, you swat these things off, but you just need to make sure that you understand what you're swatting off and that you think about it in practical terms. The access security controls are very easy. So if you look at a software system, you need to get access to it. So if you're looking at a server room, remember these are now your general controls, not your application controls. Right? How would you? I mean, how many of you have actually been to the server room in your organization? I think very few people would have been, right? But if you actually go there, you'll know that number one, the room is locked. It's access controlled. Even if you're an employee, chances are that your card will not allow you access there. It'll only be the IT staff that can have access there, and maybe upper levels of management that can have access there. If you do get in there, you can't go alone. Like I said, right? You have to go with someone. You can't be there unsupervised. Once you are there, you'll notice that it's generally temperature controlled, those sort of things. Even the fixtures that they're on, they'll be earthquake proof or they'll be encased in something, those sort of things. There might even be guards, supervising around the outside area there. It might be in a separate building. Those sort of things, they're all controls that are addressing your access to that information system. So you just need to think about it practically. You just picture it in your head, and you'll know that okay, this is what happens, and this is how we need to go about it. It's not things that you actually do need to swat off, to be honest. But I would advise that if you do struggle to come up with points, that you go through some of the ones which are highlighted in auditing notes, and which you can actually even look these up online. What we are also doing is we are working on a publication which will cover general controls in detail, but it'll be available before the exam. We are pushing for that, but we'll try and cover as many scenarios as possible where you will get general controls being implemented. And I think that would be a very good handbook for you guys to have. It's a very good reference book. And it's not just for studies, it's for practice as well. We try and actually make sure that whatever information we give you is not just going to help you in terms of your studies, but practically as well, because at the end of the day, that's the point of understanding theory. If you understand theory, the logic is that you should be able to apply it. So that's what we try and do. It's not, and if you actually understand the theory and how to apply it, it sort of works both ways, because then it sort of helps you with your studying and you are able to answer questions. So it has that knock-on effect. Right. Now, the bigger crux of this entire thing is looking at our application controls. Right. Now, application controls refer to those controls which are typically operate at a business process level and relates to the recording of transactions by individual applications. Okay, so obviously I don't expect you to memorize the definition. UNISA doesn't expect it, SICA doesn't expect it. No one really does. No one in practice, I think, knows the definition off by heart. So what you do need to know is what it relates to. And it relates, as I've said, to the input, processing, output, as well as master file maintenance controls. And this is where your questions are going to come. So you will notice that a lot of your questions, especially in the TAT letter, when it comes to your application controls, right, will come to your data that is being input into the system. So if there's, for example, an online the retailer, they'll say, okay, what should the application controls that should be in place in order to confirm the completeness of orders or the validity and accuracy of orders. So all of that will be on an input level, because if you look at a system, right, the main issue is what is going inside, because the processing is automated. You can't really do much in terms of that. So if anyone is going to do anything wrong, they're going to do it there at the input level. So this is where a huge majority of your controls and your procedures are going to be targeted at. So I would not worry too much about that, because that is relating to the computer system itself, which you are not expected to be able to audit. That would be someone like an IT auditor or someone who has a CISA. They would be responsible on all of these levels, but they would deal with that. You as an external auditor are looking predominantly here on the output as well, and the master file maintenance, because this is where human error can be involved, and this is where things can go wrong. If they're going to go wrong, they're going to go wrong here. Okay. So another thing to note is the assertions, right? Because that's where people get confused. So we've said that they will always be on these sort of assertions, right? The occurrence, completeness, accuracy, and authorization of a transaction. What's also known as authorization is where they ask for the validity. So you'll see a lot of questions in the chat letter or anywhere else will speak about the validity of your internal controls, or the validity of the transactions and the application controls which need to be in place in order to ensure this. So you do need to really understand which assertions are being tested and which assertions are relevant to the controls which you need to think about. So give that, I'd say when you're going to do a question, you need to give that some thought beforehand. It's not really something which is too difficult, because they generally are the same. The nice thing with computer systems is that they've, as much as they can be tailor-made for various organizations, there are certain things which are standard. So if you're looking at, let's use an example like Takealot, right? So you guys ordered your textbooks from Takealot. What would you have been required to do, right? You would need to create a user profile, right? So you'd have to register for an account and Takealot, right? You can't just go on and select what you want to buy and pay for it. You need to have an account. Even when you have an account, then there's certain information which you are requested to fill in. You need to fill in your email address. Even when you've filled in your email address, they'll give you a confirmation email and say that, okay, we've sent you a confirmation email to confirm this email address. Please click this link. You click that link, and then they'll say, okay, now your account is active, because they have to verify that you are a real customer and that is your email address. So you see, again, it's looking at your validity. Are you an actual customer, or are you just someone who is fictitious? So it's not a false sale. It's not a sale which is just being created to push up the revenue sort of things, right? It's not as much as you can get a fictitious employee with online, you can actually get fictitious customers as well, right? And then after that, what else do you need to do? There might be further information which they'll say you need to set up. You might need to set up payment information. You might need to verify your payment information. Your password, that is a big thing which I actually forgot about. You need to enter a password. You need to have it. So your profile has to be protected. That no one can just gain access to it. And then the password in itself has requirements which it needs to meet. It needs to be, maybe 8 letters long or 8 characters long. It might need to be a mixture of numeric and alphanumeric characters. It might need to, have capital letters as well. It might need to have a special character as well. They might say that you can't use any password you've used, recently on the site. Obviously, if you're creating a new account, that won't be relevant. But those sort of things will be in place. They might say that your username and your password can't be the same thing, because it's easy for people to guess. So do you see that? Look how we can score marks now, because these are all controls which need to be in place. And again, it's not even thinking about it. We're just going through the process. That's all we're doing. And that's how you're actually going to get your application controls right. You just need to think about a real life system. What would be in place in that system, and run with it. And just say everything that you would do and the controls which would be in place, because most of these things that you are doing are actually controls. What about when you've processed your order, well, you've added everything to your carts, and now you decide, okay, you're going to pay. Some of them will say that, okay, it has to be a credit card. They will check your credit card. Some of them will say, okay, you can do an EFT, but they'll give you a time limit. They'll say only 2 days or 3 days, and otherwise your order gets cancelled. You see, so there's various things here that are in place, and you just need to look at a real life system, and it makes it so much easier for you. And you don't need to spend hours and hours and hours studying laundry lists of application controls, because they change. I mean, I could sit here for another 2 hours and just go through an entire bucket list of application controls, and you could still go on the 23rd and rise and not know anything. So it's not about how much you swat off, it's about what you understand. So look at your systems which are out there, see how it operates in real life, and that's how you'll actually come to an ideal system, and you'll actually be able to answer questions. As I said, you just need to make sure that you are looking at the correct assertion. So, for example, verifying an email address would not deal with accuracy. And that is where you guys make mistakes, where they'll ask for the application controls to confirm the accuracy of something. And you guys will look at how the whole system operates, and you'll put all of these controls, and they are controls. They are relevant to the system, without a doubt. There's no denial or conflict in that regard. But then you're not addressing the assertion that the question is asking, and that's where you guys lose marks. If any place comes in where you guys are losing marks in auditing, a lot of students have been asking about test one, where they feel they've studied so hard but they can't understand why. It's literally small issues that you guys just overlook. It's nothing major. It's small tweaks. It's those nitty-gritty things which you just need to get right. And yeah, I do understand that under exam conditions, it's very difficult, because it's easy to make those sort of mistakes. I mean, I've made those mistakes, so I'm not even saying it in a way that's passing judgment. I've made those mistakes as well. But you just do need to be very, very careful and ensure that you read your questions properly. But we're gonna address that. I've actually dedicated time to what you're gonna do during your reading time, and how you're going to actually use exam technique to maximize your marks. Okay. Just checking if there's questions. Doesn't seem to be any. Okay. So now we're looking at exam technique for your controls and your internal controls and those sort of things. As I said, at 4862, you are unlikely to get this, but at 4861, the approach you need to follow is to make sure that you know and understand the theory. Obviously, reading the required properly is fundamental. You can't answer what you don't know you need to answer. You're not going to be answering the question. And that is where you guys actually get it wrong. It's more a case of not addressing the question completely. Does the question ask for recommendations? So if the question's asking for recommendations, then you need to make sure that you've given these, because there are marks for these. So, that's I can't begin to tell you how many students miss out on that, and it's heartbreaking, because if you get the weakness, which is the hardest part, if you can identify, then to give the recommendation is not a problem, because you already know what's missing. The recommendation generally would be to just do what they are not doing, right? So please don't make those sort of mistakes. But as I said, these are not huge questions which are going to come in at 4862 level. They can just sneak in, so I like to just cover it for the sake of completeness, because you just never know. And that's generally the trend that's happening nowadays, that UNISA set a question and bam, it's something that no one expected. So I always like to say rather be prepared instead of being surprised. So just make sure that you do have an approach. And they are in the slides, so you can go through it. We're not going to touch on this in detail. We have other important things to go through. We're looking at computerized controls now, and there is an exam technique for this. You don't need to specifically take notes for this because, as I said, you are going to get the slides anyway. I will tell the guys to forward these to you guys later on. But for computerized controls, you do, as I said, you need to relate the situation to something you've encountered in real life. So I've included an example of an airline, but it can be anything. Online retail is a big thing. So if you're looking at your revenue and receipt cycle, but there's always some sort of industry which you can relate the scenario to, and it's generally, and don't quote me on this, but generally you're going to get things relating to the revenue and receipt cycle rather than the payments or the acquisition and payment cycle. So really look at that quite extensively. See how, when you are booking for tickets to a conference, even when you book for tickets to this webinar, there was certain information which you were required to give. You had to give your email address, your name, your surname. You had to make a booking. Those sort of things. Even the coupons for the other webinar which I'm having on the 20th for IFRS 15, we've gotten a limit on the number of coupons that are there. So we've set it up like that only the first 100 students can actually, or the first 100 tickets will be at half price. The remainder will be at the full price. So we obviously need to have controls in place to make sure that that's the case. So otherwise we could end up having 200 students or 300 students in the webinar, and then most of them are actually supposed to have paid full price, but they didn't. And it's obviously like that with a lot of firms, with a lot of retailers, especially with online, because most revenue is going to be online now. It's some online system, one way or the other. Okay. And you need to know, as I said, the assertion very, very well. So we've touched on this. I don't actually repeat it too much. It's just going to get a bit mundane. But you do need to actually identify this properly, right? Because it sounds like I'm overstating it, and I know that it might sound frustrating because I'm really emphasizing on it a lot. But the truth of the matter is that when some of the scripts we end up seeing, it's just that the controls are valid but for the wrong assertion. So you can't give marks in a situation like that, and you leave the exam all thinking, no, I've nailed that question, but you've written irrelevant things, and there's nothing that we can do about it after that. And it's not a nice thing to fail, and it's even worse if you fail because of something like that, because you didn't read it, not because you didn't know your work. Right, so please just make sure that you don't make those sort of mistakes. Okay, audit evidence, right? This is our next section. And this is where we're going to look at audit evidence as a concept and general controls and application controls. We've touched on that, but we're going to look at your test of controls and your substantive procedures rather. At this point, are there any questions? Okay, it doesn't seem like they are. Okay, so audit evidence, it's a very short section. It's something you guys would have done quite extensively, I think, in your undergrad. And in a nutshell, when the auditor is obtaining audit evidence, the standard makes reference to sufficient appropriate audit evidence. It doesn't just say audit evidence. Okay, so we don't go around using the term sufficient, appropriate audit evidence in practice, I mean, it's a mouthful to say anyway. But whenever you talk about audit evidence, this is what we are talking about. And in that, we can see that it's detailing or making reference to the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. But now, what is this? Okay, so what do you understand by sufficiency? What do you understand by appropriateness? And yeah, as I said, if you guys want to type anything, please make use of that chat box on your right-hand side so that I do know I haven't lost you guys anywhere. Or if there is anything specific which you want me to address as well, right, which I haven't touched on. Okay. So sufficiency relates to the quantity of audit evidence. So when we're looking at whether something is sufficient, we're looking at whether it's enough or not. And this is determined by our sample size and number of procedures which we perform. So obviously, if our sample size is too small, it goes without saying that we probably don't have enough audit evidence. And we'd actually have to then go back to the client and tell the client that, hey, we've under-tested and we need additional samples. And this is obviously not a very nice scenario. If you are in practice, you'll know that it becomes a huge mission. Your manager will not be happy with you. The client will be even less happy with you. It's really a scenario you want to avoid. And there are some methods which are in place for determining the sample size. So you won't get asked this in the test, so don't specifically study this now. They're not going to look at things like how should the auditor determine the sample size and you know, because that's a lot of that has to do with risk assessment and things like that. It ties up to that because obviously the larger the risk of material misstatements, the larger the sample size which you would typically expect to be tested, and you know, the vice versa as well. But it's not really for the purposes of test 2. I don't think you need to spend too much time worrying about that. Then the number of procedures, because when you are on your audit file, you'll notice it's not one procedure that you'll do and it's, you know, covered the transaction, because there's a number of assertions which need to be tested. And there's no single procedure that I can think of, and I don't know if you guys have ever come across it, that will test every single assertion that there is for a transaction. Chances are you'll have to do 2 or 3 procedures. A procedure might cover 1 or 2 assertions, but it's not going to cover every. You're not going to get a procedure that will cover everything. So don't wait for that. Don't hope on that. So you do need to make sure that you've got a decent coverage when it comes to your audit procedures, so that you've actually addressed all of these. And it's quite crucial because, again, if you don't, you haven't tested, you haven't covered your assertions, how do you base your audit opinion? How do you express an opinion on this? It's very difficult to do that. So these are the sort of things that if you do get a question on the sufficiency of audit evidence, it'll be to evaluate it. That's the only real question you're going to get asked. It will be to evaluate it, and these are the areas which you will talk around, right? You will talk about the sample size, and you will look at the number of procedures. Have they covered all the assertions or not? So it's quite simple, right? Looking at the appropriateness of audit evidence, we're looking at quality, right? So relevance and reliability. Relevance, dealing with, okay, is this audit evidence relevant to what I am auditing, or is it just a document for the sake of being given a document? Does it tie up? So if you're testing debtors, you obviously want information relating to debtors. You wouldn't expect them to give you the, you know, if you want to, for example, test the trade debtors balance, them giving you the procedure for checking for credit worthiness, okay, what does it really address when it comes to the existence of debtors? You know, I mean, you'd want to be doing an external confirmation. So if they give you the, you know, the credit policy, does that really help? So that's where you're looking at your relevance, right? So again, just think about it in practice, what you would do, and it flows very, very nicely when you do it that way. Don't overload yourself with theory when it comes to this. It's very straightforward. It's very common sense type of things. It's not things that you need to kill yourself with memorizing and swatting off. And if you're actually doing that for this section, you're not studying it right. And then looking at the reliability of audit evidence. So is this audit evidence reliable? Or, is there better quality audit evidence that you can get? A golden rule is that you always opt for the best quality of audit evidence which you can get. And you'd rather get external evidence rather than internal evidence, because internal evidence, as you know, can be manipulated. So if you're looking at a debtors confirmation, I mean, if you are testing trade receivables, right, you can go and ask the clients that they give me the breakdown of this amount and give me the invoices which tie up to this amount. The truth of the matter is that they can generate this information for you, probably, if they really wanted to, and just make that balance there, and give you some sort of evidence to tie up to that. So yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that every client would do that, but a better way of doing it would be to get an external confirmation where you'll contact the debtor, and the debtor will say, hey, this is my balance, it's fine. Or they'll say, no, they've actually got it wrong, I'm not owing them this amount of money. So, those are the sort of things that do come into play, because you need to evaluate whether this audit evidence is good enough to actually express an opinion on or not. And then when you're looking at your internal evidence, right, did it come from management? So the financial director give you this? Or was it just one clerk which, pulled a report from somewhere, but it might not even be the right thing. You're not even looking at the right thing. It might not be a very strong way, documents. It might not be a very persuasive means of audit evidence. It's, those nitty-gritty things which are not things that you necessarily study in a lot of detail. And you really don't need to, but it's things that you just need to think about, that's all. So if you get a question again on audit evidence, it's just going to be to evaluate it on that level. And if you have to evaluate the appropriateness, then these 2 bullet points are what you need to look at, right? And you discuss it around those points. You're not going to get a huge 40-mark question on it. I don't even think you'll get beyond a 10-mark question, if you even get one. But 10 to 15 marks is maximum, right? So you discuss it around these points, you will definitely be putting a lot of relevant points, and you should do well enough to pass. And if you want to get more points or think about more ideas, you can always just go to ISA 500 and pull out maybe a few more paragraphs from there and sort of try and see where the scenario is relevant to what you looked at, and discuss it around those points. But that's really, if you really want to give your answer a lot more meat. But honestly, that's a time management issue which you need to think about. I don't think it's really necessary. Okay, now we come to test of controls. Okay, and these are pretty much what will be asked. Whether you're at 4861 or whether you're doing 4862, you should expect them, and with good reason, because they are very relevant and they are very important, and you're not going to get through this year without being examined on it, either now or during the exam, or maybe even both, right? So it's not that I've seen the papers so that I'm telling you that no, study it, but I can tell you now that just understanding it from an importance perspective, because these are what you do. Now, what a lot of people get worried about is the formulation of these, right? So I have included the definition, but I'm not going to read each slide out, right? I mean, you guys can read it. If you have any questions, then just please, as I said, type it in the chat box. But what is important is that, it's an audit procedure, and it's to detect or prevent material misstatements, and they fall into those 3 categories. And a nice acronym to remember them is ROI, Re-Performance, Observation, and Inspection. And that is generally what your test of controls are going to be geared at. But now what you want to know is how do you formulate these, because that's what the question is going to ask you, and that's really what you're not sure about, right? And this is something which plagues many students, and I feel personally that universities sometimes overstress students on these sort of concepts. So there is a general format which they want you to follow, where and I'll show you in the next slide, where they say that you're going to put the verbs, so you'll say reperform or observe or inspect, and then it'll say what, so you'll put the document and then you'll give the reason for it at the end, and it's fine. But again, apply yourself, apply your mind, and don't be afraid to write. So if you're looking at test of controls, and if you guys are doing articles, or you've already completed your articles, or you are in industry, right, you can actually just see what is happening there. So if you're looking at re-performance, observation, and inspection, even when you're looking at your questions, you're going to see a lot of them are geared around these things. If you've actually covered these types of classifications, you are actually well on your way to doing extremely well on that question. So you can only re-perform a calculation or re-perform an activity, or you can re-perform a process, basically. So the first thing you need to do is you need to identify these things, and that's what you're going to do during your reading time. So if you're going to, even with a calculation, actually, I wouldn't even say re-perform a calculation, I'd say recalculate, right? But if you're looking at the process, it can be, a clocking in process, which you just want to make sure that, hey, does this actually work? So it's not a difficult thing to really word out, but it's something you need to make sure that you can identify. So if I think of an example, right, so let's say if we are doing a wage count, that's a process, right? It's not a document. So re-perform the wage process, right? Now you have to ask yourself this question, right? Because I said that re-perform a process is generally what it relates to. Would it be practical to re-perform a process? They could re-perform it, but the thing is, it's not really going to make much sense. So would it not be better just to observe the wage process being done? And that's something which you guys need to, it's a 50-50. And the problem with these two is that, and especially with observation, because observation is strictly on processes only. And again, the issue is that you come there, unless it's on a surprise basis, if you come there, they can do everything correctly just to satisfy you, and then do everything wrong the moment you're gone. So that's the tricky thing with processes, but you have to identify them. And the first point of order is to say, observe it, right? But you could re-perform it, in my opinion, depending on whether it would be practical to do so or not. Right, so it's something which you do need to look at. But then you can also look at calculations, which instead of saying you re-perform, you'll say recalculate. The VAT on the invoice, things like that. Although that does come more into substantive procedures. So again, it's more about identifying your types of controls which are there, but your observation and your re-performance are not huge occurrences, or in tests you're not really going to get a lot of these, because of these examples and scenarios which I'm coming up with, which I'm telling you of. It's, you can see it's very nitty-gritty, it's like sticky, it's just, it doesn't flow, right? So you really need to look at the scenario very, very carefully. It's not one of those things which are very common. What is very common is going to be inspect. And I like inspect because you can always inspect a document. So wherever you go through that question or that case study and they make reference to an inspection, then well, they won't make reference to inspection, they'll make reference to a document. So they'll say a purchase order, a delivery note, a goods received note, those sort of things, right? You're always going to inspect it. And you're going to inspect it for what? Because there will be a control performed on it. So it'll be stamped or it'll be signed, right? And those are free marks, which I can guarantee you now, which even if you open your TAT letters now and you look at them, anywhere there's a document, they will tell you, inspect the purchase order for the signature of the purchasing manager to ensure that it was authorized, things like that. It is always going to be there, guaranteed, without a doubt, 100%, because that is what you will do with inspect. So make sure that you have to identify what you are going to do the verb on, and inspecting is generally always on a document. So wherever you've got your documents, know that you're going to inspect it. And this is significant because if you get a system and you've got five documents in that system, then what's going to happen is that you need to inspect all five because they will be signed, right? If they're not signed, then they'll be stamped, but they have to be authorized, because remember we said that a document has to be authorized. It can't not be authorized, otherwise you're going to have a control weakness and a deficiency over there. So those are important things that you do need to take into account, right? Another one which I actually haven't put in the slide is access controls. So wherever there is an access control, and I'm sure that you guys can identify access controls at this point, whether they're physical or logical, and logical meaning that they are on the computer, the best way of doing it is to try and gain access without an access card. So for example, they'll say that the building is controlled and requires an access card to get into it, right? And then an appropriate test of control would be to say that, okay, try and gain access to the building without an access card to make sure that access is not granted. And the second part of that is try and gain access to the building with an access card to make sure that access is granted. It's two. What about passwords? Try and gain access to a profile without a password to make sure that access is denied. Try and gain access with a password to make sure that access is granted. It might say that if there's an incorrect password, you will not gain access. So try and gain access to the system using an incorrect password to confirm that access is denied. And try and gain access to the system using a correct password to ensure that access is granted. You see, the main thing is just to identify controls, and once you've done that, then it becomes almost generic because it's the same type of test that can be performed regardless of the system that you're in. Whatever system you get, whether it's a revenue system or payment system, computerized, whatever, if there is a document, you need to inspect it for approval. If there's an access control, you have to try and gain access the right way and try and gain access without having your means of access to it, to make sure that you don't gain that access. So those are the sort of things which you do need to cover. And if you can formulate it using that, then it's a lot easier. Okay, now we're looking at our substantive procedures, and with substantive procedures, this is where a lot of students do struggle, and it's mostly coming down to the documentation on how do you formulate them. If you look at the format which is here, right, it says the procedure, document, reason, right? So basically, in a nutshell, what this is saying is that if you are performing a substantive procedure, when a marker is looking at it, they want these three elements there. It does not necessarily always be the case. It's not possible to always have that, because, for example, if I say obtaining a management representation letter, I mean, it's not really tying in with the way you'd expect your general procedures to be going. It's they do differ. But the idea is that these three elements should be there. So you should say what you are going to do. Are you going to recalculate, reperform, inspect, trace, agree, those sort of things? What are you going to do and why? And the why is more just to show that you do understand it and that you are actually assessing the case study properly and that you're addressing your assertions. So with substantive procedures, that makes it very important that you understand the system well, and you need to read that case study maybe a few times just to actually see which documents are involved, which processes are involved, the information on the documents, and that sort of thing. You also need to make sure that you understand the assertion which you're working with. So it's not likely that you're going to get a question that's going to ask you to cover all the assertions. It's way too many procedures to do. But what is commonly asked is occurrence, completeness, and accuracy. Okay. Cutoff and classification, those are very simple. You test, it's basically tracing it for classification to the correct account to make sure that it's classified correctly, or that it meets the definition. So if you're looking at an intangible asset that has been capitalized, you'll basically just look at the requirements of ISA 3, not ISA, IAS 38, and make sure that, okay, this is actually an intangible asset. Has it been classified? Yes, it is. So it's correct. Those sort of things. But those are, again, they're almost generic. They're not really things you need to think about. So there's not a lot of marks that you would expect to be allocated to things like that. Your bulk of marks are going to come to occurrence, completeness, and accuracy when it comes to your transactions, and your existence, completeness, rights and obligations when it comes to your account balances, and maybe actually valuation as well. So I think actually your account balances do have a lot more procedures that get performed per assertion, but it's again very dependent on the system that you're working with and how they actually set it up. But in a nutshell, okay, whenever there are calculations, okay, on a document or figures, right, accuracy is always going to be an issue, right? And you do need to know that recalculating the VAT, for example, would be a substantive procedure, because you need to ensure that they've calculated the VAT correctly. Then recalculating the total, maybe of the invoice, because it could be a bunch of numbers or items on the invoice which they have been added up. You want to make sure that, okay, this is actually done correctly. In most cases, it's not really going to be an issue, especially since it's computerized. So the odds of that being a mistake is next to nothing. But like what I'm trying to point out to is, you don't need to memorize all of these things. There are more things that you need to think about, and that is coming from a practical point of view as well. So if there's a calculation, recalculate it. In a nutshell is what I'm saying. If there are facts and figures, recalculation or tracing becomes important, because this is where accuracy comes in. So tracing the figures from the trial balance to the financials is an accuracy. Tracing it from the GL to the trial balance is, again, it's confirming accuracy. So do you see how it's, when you are agreeing numbers or you recalculate numbers, these are covering your accuracy assertion. So think about it in that sort of way. You can memorize a lot of these things. It's not that I'm saying you shouldn't, but you can't put yourself in a type of position where you expect that you're going to just memorize a whole laundry list of account balances, because some industries, I mean, what happens if it comes to something like revenue? An industry could have revenue from the sale of goods, and another one could have for rendering a service, and the services are all different. So the services an accounting firm will have will be very different to how a cleaning company would operate. It's very different to how an airline would operate. It's very different to how a property company would operate. So do you see all of these things that it becomes very difficult just to have a laundry list of it? It's better if you understand it. I mean, if you have lists of procedures which would be performed on rental income, on these sort of things, it's fine. It's good to have, but the fundamental thing is that you do need to know that formulating these procedures is going to be linked to your understanding of what procedure to perform on the document. Okay. And that is where students struggle. So when you read the case study, you need to look at the accounting records which are at play, because this is what the substantive procedures actually relate to. They are looking at the accounting records and the source documents. So that is what you need to really revolve around, and you need to apply your mind when it comes to these things. So if you're looking at rental income, right, what would be a good thing for occurrence? If I want to make sure that the rental income I've received, okay, it's actually occurred, things like that. Would I not want to inspect the lease agreement or the rental contract to make sure that it's been signed, so it's valid, to make sure that it actually is already effective, because maybe the lease is for the 1st of June and we're looking at the 1st of April, which was not too long ago. So obviously the lease is not effective, so that's not lease income. So why are they including it there? Those sort of things. It's so, again, it's not things you can simply swat off. They are things that you need to think about. And I understand that a lot of you get afraid because you don't want to get it wrong, because you worried that, okay, if I write it down, what happens if I think the wrong thing? The thing is that think about the assertion that you're looking at, and is the procedure addressing the assertion? If it is, there is a level of leniency in the marking. It's not that you are going to just be thrown out. So if something comes to mind, then don't be afraid to put it on paper, because that is where you lose out on a lot of marks. You think that what you've actually thought about is wrong, and it just falls away. There are a lot of general procedures which you can get marks for. Those obviously you will put them down. I mean, but sometimes the question will say exclude general procedures. So then what happens? You can't go into a panic mode after that. You then need to know that, okay, there are other procedures you can formulate, and the formulation of those procedures is going to be based on what would you do in practice if you were a trainee and you were gone there, or if you wanted to, if you were an investigator, let's put it that way. You have to almost think in that sort of level. So it's very easy just to say that, no, follow this procedure or the format that you'll say the procedure, the documents, and the reason. And that's what we are told over and over and over again. But the truth of the matter is that that is not a sufficient way of learning substantive procedures. If it was, no one would be struggling with it. And you do need to actually think about it in a logical manner, in a practical manner. What would you do in real life? What would you do in practice? If you wanted to verify this, what would you do? And this is why understanding the assertions becomes very important, because that will lead you to your procedures. Okay, so that is why I'm really gaining on that you do need to make sure that you are on point with what your assertions are, because if you don't understand your assertions, you can't formulate procedures to test them. So what I would suggest with your substantive procedures is that you actually go through a couple of questions, get a sort of feel for how you're supposed to be answering them. So you go through your chat letter, you'll see that, okay, with rental income, this is what they're talking about. With service income, this is what they're talking about. You'll see a lot of things when it comes to revenue will be to inspect the contract, to make sure that, with leases as well. Anywhere, in fact, where there is a contract, you'll have to inspect the contract. So do you see, as you do it, you'll start seeing that, okay, yeah, this is a general trend where there is a contract that is signed. You'll say, I must actually inspect the contract. And that's how you're going to get the feel for it. If they come to things like provisions, for example, you'll want to look at because it could be a provision for rehabilitation costs. The entity might be in legal trouble, so you'll say, okay, fine, let's look at the lawyer's letter. Let's look at the calculation for this. Let's look at the estimates. Let's look at, obviously you're not going to write it in that way, but those are what you would think of, and then you'd formulate it in an auditing way. So you'd say, inspect the correspondence from the lawyers to confirm that a legal obligation does exist, those sort of things, So again, there's no hard and fast rule that you can actually get. It's very difficult to actually say that, look, it's going to be 1, 2, and 3, because there are so many types of account balances and transactions which you can get. The biggest problem which every student actually has with this is it's only a confidence problem. It's not a problem that's actually relating to anything else. You guys actually know how to formulate substantive procedures. As I said, you just have to think you are an inspector, or that you came to investigate, or like you're a detective. And what would you, if you once you start thinking in that way, you'll see just how easy it is to write those substantive procedures. And so make sure that you do that. And as I said, that you're obviously going to know which documents to inspect by reading the case study. So you have to read the case study, see, hey, these documents are here, these accounting records are here, this is what I'm going to work with, this is what I'm going to base my procedures on, this is what I'm going to check, this is what I'm going to inspect, this is what I'm going to review. This is the information on this document. Are the calculations there? Great. I can recalculate these calculations. Those sort of things. Again, bearing in mind which assertion they have asked you to perform procedures for, because there's no point in performing a recalculation for something like completeness. It doesn't really help. So those are the sort of things that you need to think about, and you need to really apply it in that way, because even when if you've looked at past ITC papers, you will see that that's how they formulate the procedures in a very practical manner. I don't think you can be penalized if you do that. So don't stress about substantive procedures. Really just run with it, and don't leave it blank. Please don't leave it blank. I know a lot of people, they can't think of it. They feel that, no, it has to go in that golden thread, or that, that specific format that they show, and the moment they can't think of a procedure to fit it in, they just start panicking, and then they leave it blank. Don't do that. I mean, even when you're at work, if you are doing your articles, you'll see everything does not fit into that format. It's a suggested guideline, but everything does not fit in there. So try and get it into that format if you can, because obviously, but even if it's not exactly like that, it's fine, because chances are you are going to have the procedure, you are going to have the document there, because the procedure can only be performed on the documents and your reason. Okay, so looking at exam technique, okay, and this is pretty much reaching the end of it. What do you do in your reading time? Because this has been a topic of discussion. A lot of people have been struggling with this, right? So during your reading time, especially when it comes to test 2, I would suggest that you first identify the cycle that you're working with, because it makes it much better to actually put everything into context. Secondly is to identify the documents which are there. So whatever is a document, like I said, you need to look at whatever is an access control. Look at that, highlight it, whether you have a separate highlighter for things like that, it's up to you. But make sure that these are things which you can identify, because you don't want to go and hunt for them again. So do this during your reading time, right? And don't try and predict the required, because you're not going to be able to do that. I think a lot of people would have told you that. Just try and gather as much information from your reading time as possible. Try and get through that case study, because if you don't, okay, it's not the end of the world, but for test 2, I think it's still okay. For the exam especially, there's just too much of reading that you leave towards the end. So don't do that. It makes it a lot harder for yourself. It just puts you in a panic. So what you want to do is you want to try and get a good feel for this. For test 2, as I said, once you've identified the documents that are there, it makes it easier, because then when you have to formulate your test of controls, bam, you already know what to inspect. So if you've highlighted 4 documents and they say what are the test of controls which you would perform, or which should be performed by the auditor, it's very easy. You've already got 4 procedures or 4 controls which you can get down within 5 minutes. I mean, it just makes it so much simpler. And that is the point of your reading time, right? To understand also where your documents are, because for your substantive procedures, what ties in where. So those sort of things. So you've got your documents, you know what you're inspecting, you know what verb to use on them, those sort of things. Is it computerized or is it a manual system? That's also another thing to look at. So it's not a difficult one, but it's just a structured way that you need to have your reading time, because otherwise you're just going to waste those minutes, and you can actually score a lot of marks in those minutes without realizing it. Okay, so that will cover your reading time. Then looking at your time management, you would have understood that a lot of people will tell you to make sure that you've answered every single question, and that's actually the best way of doing it. So you need to just use your reading time as well as possible to make sure that you've highlighted all the important information, so that you don't spend your writing time reading again. You will obviously go through the question a few times, but it's not that you're going to read it another 3 or 4 times. You're just going to make it much more difficult for yourself. So don't do that. Your time management needs to be where your reading time is spent in reading and your writing time is spent mostly in writing or planning out your answer. Don't do that, where you get this whole scope of it wrong, right? You need to really, really make sure that it's spent writing and thinking about your answer. That's what you want to be doing in your writing time. You don't want to be looking through your standards too much as well, but so that's what will help with that is if they are flagged and if you do understand your theory. And set your time limits for each question. So you can do that in your reading time as well, where you can work out, I think it's 1.5 minutes per mark. So you know that, okay, part A, so many minutes, part B, so many minutes, part C, so many minutes, and stick to that. If you don't finish a question, you don't finish it, but it's better to have 5 questions which are about 70 or 80% complete than to have 4 questions which are 100% complete, which will probably never be the case anyway, and then you have 1 blank one. And then you end up getting absolutely no marks for that blank one. And then everything else just, falls apart, because now you've automatically got to push so much harder in those other questions. You're not looking for 50% there anymore. You just, put undue pressure on yourself in that way. What can be asked is, we've touched on this quite a bit, but very likely you are going to get a test of controls question, and so your application controls would also factor in there, where they will ask for the validity and accuracy of something. You guys do have a lot of questions in your TAT letters which address this. Remember your password controls as well. Don't overlook your password controls because they can be easy marks, and you don't want to miss out on that. And they generally the same as well. They don't change. Your password controls are pretty standard, and those are things which I would suggest that you just have this. So the moment you see that, hang on, there's a password that's required to be entered into the system to gain access, you can, I mean, you can get about 5 marks maybe, depending on how many marks you decide to allocate for password controls, but you can get quite a few. And the last one, would your substantive procedures would be that they can ask Companies Act substantive procedures. I don't think that is likely to come out in test 2 though. I think it has come out before, and I don't think that they'll repeat it now for test 2. So I'm not saying don't study it, but I haven't touched on it much in this webinar because I don't feel that it's really going to be a relevant question in test 2. I mean, they could, so I wouldn't say leave it out of your studying, but given the fact that it was tested in test 2, I think last year, I wouldn't expect them to repeat that now again. I think that's more likely to come out in your exam. I think they'll probably try and give you a mix of application controls and substantive procedures on a system. Most likely, I would assume it would be the revenue cycle, right? Especially with IFRS 15 being implemented, and I think that's a very good way of going. So I'm not saying spot, but I'm saying if you start your studying somewhere, start there, make sure you've covered that. Rather cover that instead of studying everything else and not covering this. Because if you can't cover anything, make sure at least you've covered this, right? How to answer, I think we've touched on this during the presentation on most things, but just make sure that your answering is relevant to the question. So you've read the required. You don't need to rewrite the required. I have noticed some people doing that. You don't need to do that, okay? And please don't. You're just wasting time. I also feel that you should start each part on a separate page. It's nicer to mark. It's easier to mark. And if you think of a new answer later on while you're writing, it gives you space to sort of fill it in, compared to if you just leave like 2 or 3 lines and then you end up scratching it out, and then you see that now you shorten space and you scratch everything out and then you write at the back of the question paper. Do you see how inefficient that sort of method is to answer? So just have part A on one, and look, you can see for yourself whether you're going to need 1 or 2 pages, but start each part on a new page. It's fine. The answer books are, if you need 2 answer books, you need 2 answer books. It's fine, but spread it out. Don't feel like you need to get everything on 2 or 3 pages, right? Spread out your answer, give yourself room to answer, and don't cramp your answers up. It makes it difficult to read. It makes it difficult to actually mark it. And you don't, if you look at the thousands of scripts which are being marked, I mean, you don't need the examiner or the marker rather to be struggling to find your answers. So don't make it difficult to hunt for it. At the same time, don't go overboard with using different colored pens and that. I mean, it's nice to make your answer very presentable, but at the same time, don't overdo it. Okay, those are the sort of things which you do need to consider and you do need to think about when you are planning your answer as well. And like I've said, don't be afraid to actually put your thoughts down on paper, because the moment you do that, that's when you are going to just delay time. You're gonna waste time. You're gonna delay your answer. You're just going to make things worse for yourself. And before you know it, you've actually done nothing in the time that's gone by. Okay, with the substantive procedures especially, I mean, it might be a very different way of learning it, but do it practically, because that is what this whole syllabus is leaning towards. It is practical answers. So think about what you would do in practice and do it on the paper. That is where your thought needs to go. And if you guys are doing articles, or you guys are working, really, I think you guys have a bit of an advantage in terms of the practical understanding in that way. So, and you don't have the time to sit and SWOT anyway. So use what you are learning at work, right? Try and apply it. It is relevant, and you can use it. You really, really can. Don't think that it's just a wasted procedure. Don't let fear stop you, basically. And the last one is don't forget the easy marks. You'd be surprised as to how many people do that. So there's always format marks, which will count for at least 5% of the paper. So you can expect at least 2 marks in test two to be for format and your presentation and those sort of things. So don't miss those marks. Those are easy marks. Those can really help you when it comes to exam entrance, or when it just comes to getting a good year mark, right? So don't leave that out. And once you've gotten those 2 marks, I mean, it makes it a lot easier because you only need 20 out of 40 to pass. You've gotten those 2 marks, so now you only need 18. And I think with the remainder of the question, you definitely can pull out 18 marks from that question paper because it's 18 out of a remaining 38. So, I mean, really, that's well below 50%. Okay, so just make sure that you look at those easy marks, and not just those easy marks. We have also highlighted the test of controls. We have said if there's a document, you can inspect the document. Those are easy marks. I mean, you can really, really get those quite simply. You don't need to make this harder than it needs to be. I'll tell you now, 40% of the marks in the paper are actually easy marks, and then you're getting your two marks for format. So it's really just that nitty gritty stuff which you need to get right to pass. That's all. Okay. Okay. If you've got any other questions, we do have some time, so you can type it in the chat box. If you don't think of anything right now, you can send them via our Facebook page and inbox us there. We'll answer them there. And for a free sample of our study guides, you can email marketing@quadrantacademy.com, but we don't have those samples ready as yet. So I would put that thought on ice at the moment. But we are going to be launching that because we do want to sort of get that up and running before exams. But just keep it in mind because if you guys do need, we are definitely ready to assist you guys in that. The team will get in touch with you should you need to inquire about anything with regards to that. And then that's all for for our presentation. That's actually your preparation. I hope it was fruitful for you guys. I hope that you guys did get a better understanding of what is required for test 2, that you are a lot more comfortable with it. As I've said, that don't stress yourself out with questions too much. Don't overdo it. Don't overcomplicate it. A lot of people probably did that when it came to test 1, and it's really not necessary. Sometimes simpler is better. So that's how you need to approach it. With regards to this section of the audit, a lot of it is field work. So if you are in practice, this is not supposed to be a difficult section for you. And learn what you've used in practice. Okay, sometimes the textbook can actually confuse you, but learn what you've used in practice. Be brave in your answering. Go and substantiate your points. Make sure that your foundational knowledge is there, and that's all you really need to do. And don't overthink it. It's just these basic points, and it's as I've given you quite a few tips and hints that you can actually use just to score some easy marks as well. But you need to think about this in a practical way. And if you've been doing this in practice, you are definitely fine to do it in theory. You don't need to. If you feel like there's another, you're supposed to be memorizing a lot of things. No, you do not need to be memorizing a lot of things for this section. You might feel like you're going in underprepared if you don't memorize a whole bunch of things. I can guarantee you now, especially those of you who have done this before, those laundry lists don't work. They really don't. So obviously they can't be the right approach. So really don't feel like you doing something wrong by not doing that. You're actually keeping your mind fresh, and there's no time to remember all of that anyway. So think of it in a practical way. Think of it, and if you do still struggle, please do get in touch with us. We want to make sure that you are going into test 2 as prepared as you can be. Okay. But other than that, thank you very much. We really appreciate you guys joining us on this Saturday. We hope that you guys do understand this content a lot better. And if you guys have any questions, please do let us know. Yeah, and you guys, if you can leave us a review on our YouTube, on our Facebook page, that would be appreciated as well. But yeah, we'll leave that to you guys. It's not really compulsory, but we would appreciate it if you guys did do it. But yeah, enjoy your day and good luck with the rest of your studying. And please do keep in touch if you guys do need any more information.